Locked doors hide mysteries. Keyholes can reveal answers. I'm Revel Arroway, and this is Keyhole Witness. Welcome back, fellow witnesses. This week I bring you the unusual tale of two sisters, twins, whose protected routine lives keep them far from being recognized as part of a massive American melodrama, despite having been there. What I tell, I do not report, I just tell. Please enjoy Animal Crackers. Marcia and Marilyn had always lived in the house on Thomas Avenue. Their father had grown up in this house, their grandfather had as well. Their great-grandfather had built the house nearly a century earlier and died in it. The house had passed from oldest boy to oldest boy, but now seemed adrift, housing a family that had no oldest boy. Marcia and Marilyn were twins, the only two children of Jasper Bruns III and Melinda Bruns, née Fresna. Jasper III had followed in the footsteps of his father, Jasper Jr., and his grandfather, Jasper Sr., first growing into the status of the family, then growing into the ownership of the Victorian house, then taking over the family construction material supply business when his father suffered his stroke. Old Jasper, who had once been young Jasper while his father, the first Jasper, had lived, now occupied one of the 3 bedrooms available, the smallest, the room in the back that had once served the live-in housemaid Nanny, who had looked after the twins for the first years of their lives. Jasper III, now known as young Jasper, as his father had been, had gotten married in 1932 to Melinda, the girl from around the corner, up Thomas Avenue to the right on Bowl Street. Melinda was also from a family that made up part of the established community, the heart of business, medicine, press, and the majority of the who's who of Dallas. Their marriage was celebrated at the First Presbyterian Church on Yonge Street. Everyone from the neighborhood attended, as did others from other parts of the country who lived in other such established neighborhoods in their own towns, and so belonged to the same dispersed yet exclusive club. Now, being a member of this type of club carried with it a number of expectations. People would live in grand houses that were elaborately decorated, both inside and outside, to serve as settings for grand events like baptisms and comings of age, birthdays and weddings, retirements and funerals. From its inauguration in 1885 as the Bruns House on Thomas Avenue, the majestically pillared porch had received many of these types of society events, from the wedding of Jasper Jr., the first young Jasper, in 1905, through the funeral of Jasper Sr., the first old Jasper, in 1926. A new generation was established with the birth of Jasper III, the new young Jasper, in 1906, and promised continuance was expected with his wedding in 1932, an expectation dashed by the birth of the twins, Marcia and Marilyn, in 1933. You see, one of the expectations of people who lived in grand houses in grand neighborhoods was that the first child born would be a boy, the new young person who would carry on the family name, live in the family house, take over the family business. Such had been the case for 2 Bruns generations. The heritage was young and needed establishment into the future. Yet Melinda had not done her part. She had not brought Jasper III, young Jasper, the boy-child who would perpetuate the dynasty. She had borne not only female, but 2 females, and, to add insult to injury, she had damaged her reproductive organs in the event. There would never be a boy-child to carry on the family name, live in the family house, take over the family business. Jasper III leaned against the wall in the hallway outside his wife's private room in the old Parkland Hospital. The family doctor, Dr. Peters, who lived in another grand house just over on Clark Street, put his hand on young Jasper's right shoulder as he explained, Melinda had nearly bled out. She had passed not only the birth matter, she had passed part of her matrix. Young Jasper didn't ask if his wife would survive the difficult delivery of 2 girls. He instead asked how long before his wife might carry another, an heir. Dr. Peters shook his head, effectively emasculating young Jasper for life. From that moment, Jasper felt that he was surrounded by women all the time in his home. Melinda was always pouting in the front sitting room. The nanny, Charlotte, was always somewhere upstairs with the 2 girls. There was a cook whose name he wasn't sure of, always in the kitchen. Jasper began spending all his time at work or at the club. Jasper Jr., once young Jasper and now old Jasper, checked out of the office after suffering a stroke in '43, just as young Jasper turned 37 years old. This left the control of the company to Jasper III. Jasper Jr., now old Jasper, was left slobbering on his shirt fronts and soiling his shorts, which of course meant a day nurse upstairs in the back room at the Bruns house on Thompson Avenue. Young Jasper had no difficulty taking over the construction supply company. Nothing had changed in the business during old Jasper's time, and young Jasper was mainly sitting behind that large wooden desk through inertia. Men who worked around young Jasper were eyeing him carefully, both because he was known to drink at that desk and because he had no heir, meaning the company would be open prey within their lifetimes. Young Jasper also spent hours at a private club with other men of his social status. It was, of course, an exclusively male club with dark rooms, armchairs thickly upholstered in leather with small, low tables to the right where decanters of liquor sat awaiting the moment the contents be tipped into waiting crystal tumblers, which awaited the moment to be agitated from side to side, then lifted to thick lips. Young Jasper had been lucky, even though Prohibition had not had that big of an impact on these kinds of private men's clubs. It had been lifted the same year the twins had been born, meaning he could legally pickle his brain anywhere. And having that pickled brain left young Jasper a bit loud and unpleasant. The other men in the club tolerated him. They pitied him. No one should be left with such a successful business, a business that, unlike many, had survived, nay, thrived, despite the Depression, and no heir to take it over. No one should be cast from their home by an army of females. A wife was necessary, a daughter a treat to be married off wisely. Servants weren't really women, unless the master took an eye to one. So when young Jasper began diatribes on local politics, the other men would simply nod along with him, never contradict what he had to say. He would end up the only man shouting among them. And they all knew that politics were a cover for deeper envies and frustrations and power struggles they all shared. Jasper and all of his fellow club members knew who really pulled the strings, got things done in Dallas. Jasper's home had become, then, a strange, almost dark place. Melinda wouldn't come out of that dark place the twins' birth had placed her in. The combined stress of knowing that she would not have more children, and the blame her husband placed upon her for not having given him an heir, left her sitting in the sitting room, drinking just about as heavily as her husband. For the first 10 years of their lives, the girls had not had a mother. They had had a nanny, that strange woman named Charlotte. Charlotte was employed on good references from a former employer, but neither Melinda nor Jasper had done much more than smile and nod during the interview and agree at once that she move into that small room at the back, almost a closet, across the hall from the girls' shared room at the front that gave on to the second-story porch. Though Charlotte's time as a nanny began as any other, with daily baths and dressings and playtime and walks outdoors, the walks outdoors would suddenly come to an end when the girls turned 4. During the following 6 years, none of the 3 would leave the second story of the house, and all because of the accident. It was, of course, a routine day. Charlotte was brushing Marcia's hair while Marilyn played alone in the corner. Marcia was being fussy, and Charlotte was paying no mind to Marilyn, who suddenly decided to sneak out the bedroom door that Charlotte had left open. Marilyn marched right to the stairway, began to descend, and tumbled right down the stairs to the first floor, landing neatly on her forehead. Marilyn didn't cry. She was KO'd by the fall. No one had heard the fall, and Charlotte didn't notice Marilyn's absence until she'd finished brushing out Marcia's knotted locks. When she did notice, she put Marcia into the corner where Marilyn had been playing and strolled out into the hallway. Not seeing Marilyn anywhere on the landing, Charlotte started down the stairs and saw the girl on the floor at the bottom. She didn't rush down. Charlotte wasn't one to rush anything. She simply walked down the stairs, scooped the unconscious child up, and checked to see if she was still breathing. She was still breathing, so Charlotte simply went back upstairs and put Marilyn in her bed and left the room, locking the door behind her so the girl wouldn't escape again. The plan was to let Marilyn sleep it off, and Marilyn did sleep it off. For 3 days she slept it off. But no one but Charlotte noticed. The door would remain locked. Melinda never checked on the twins, and Jasper always pretended that they didn't exist. Of course, it wasn't obvious at once that the knock on her head had done Marilyn any damage. It actually wasn't until the girls were old enough to go to school that anyone noticed that Marilyn hadn't really kept up with her sister mentally. Marcia was moving forward as a girl, seemed to be developing as any normal 6-year-old would, while Marilyn seemed to have only aged a few months more over the 2 years since the fall. Marilyn didn't speak clearly. She wouldn't dress herself. She only played with baby toys, never invented games, and had a bad temper. And the only things she would eat by herself were animal crackers. Anything else had to be nearly force-fed. So, when it was time to send the girls to school, it was clear that Marilyn wasn't going to be able to perform, and Marcia couldn't be sent alone. What would the neighbors think? So Charlotte found it easy to convince Jasper and Melinda that a home learning arrangement would have to be had. Charlotte was the first to give the girls lessons. However, Charlotte hardly had more than an elementary knowledge of anything beyond child care, and it quickly became clear that a real instructor would be needed. When the girls were 10, when their grandfather suffered his stroke and needed a nurse to care for him, it was decided that Marcia was old enough to look after her sister. Charlotte was let go, and a day nurse was employed to look after Jasper, the old, as well as keep an eye on the girls when their daily tutor was not attendant, giving them lessons. That was easy for the day nurse, as the girls were always locked in their room when alone. Marilyn would never progress intellectually much farther than around 8 years of age. The girls were never officially presented to society. Their existence was almost a local secret. Everyone knew they existed, but it was assumed that Marcia would be her sister's keeper for life, that the Bruns household would turn into an asylum for a grieving widow. No one expected Jasper to be as long-lived as his father, and 2 old maids. When the girls were 20 years of age, it was decided that Marcia could keep a key of her own to their room. This opening to a certain liberty meant that they could begin taking daily walks around the neighborhood. They wouldn't go far. Their walk would last just about an hour, half an hour walking in one direction, then half an hour returning home. They almost never made a circle. They would walk and then return. They also kept strictly to themselves, did not address strangers on the street or acknowledge neighbors. As the years passed, the 2 sisters became a regular installation around the St. Thomas district of Dallas. Marcia would be dressed smartly, a prim dress or dark skirt with blouse, a jacket on cooler days, a sweater when the weather was fine. Marilyn looked only a little more eccentric. Marcia took care that Marilyn put on matching clothing, clean shoes, stockings without runs. Yet Marilyn almost always wore a jacket no matter what the weather, almost always wore a scarf, and in her later years insisted on wearing large, dark sunglasses, complaining that the Texas sun blinded her. And while Marcia carried an attractive handbag where she kept her house keys and a bit of change, Marilyn always carried with her a small box of animal crackers in case she became peckish on their walks. When the girls were not taking those strolls, they sat in their room on the 2nd floor of the Bruns' house on Thomas Avenue. Marcia always kept the room locked when they were there and when they were not. It was just a precaution. Neither she nor her sister remembered the accident themselves, but they remembered Charlotte warning them of the danger of the unlocked door. In their room they would rock and chat as Marcia did handiwork like knitting or crocheting, and Marilyn colored drawings of animals inspired by the exotic creatures on the box of animal crackers she kept nearby. She'd stop and pick up the box, holding it carefully in both hands, bring it close to her face, study the lines and colors, then try to imitate them in her drawings. Because they had the room at the front of the house, they had access to the porch formed between the two white columns. On sunny afternoons they would slip out onto that porch, sit in comfortable rockers there, and watch their neighbors stroll about. Their lives were simple, routine, without expectations. Their mother tolerated them, their father ignored them, the cook fed them. So it was a chilly November day in the early 1960s. The girls were now 30 years old, their father 57, their grandfather still hanging in there at 80, their mother an unnoticeable 51. Their father spent all his time at work and at the club, though less at the club in the evenings. He bought a television and was obsessed with looking at news programs in the evening. Their mother spent all her time pickled in the sitting room, except when her husband was home. Then she'd spend her time pickled in their bedroom. And the girls took their daily walks, sat in their room and chatted, sat on the balcony and watched the neighbors. This November day, Marcia decided that they would walk down to Dealey Plaza by way of McKinley Avenue. Marilyn loved Dealey Plaza and was especially fascinated by the old red courthouse just down the street. The day began a bit nasty, a light rain making everything feel damp. By 11, though, the temperature had risen to an acceptable 63 degrees, and a breeze was shifting the clouds, allowing a bit of sun to peek through. Marcia wore a dark wool skirt, a formal pink blouse, black pumps, and a plaid waistcoat. Marilyn whined a bit until Marcia agreed to let her wear her favorite beige long coat with the high collar, a rose-colored silk scarf over her hair, and those big, dark sunglasses. And of course, Marcia carried her handbag and Marilyn her box of animal crackers. They set out from their home at about 11:15 and began to walk briskly in order to warm up. As the two women neared the area of Dealey Plaza, Marcia noticed that there was an excitement in the air. She wasn't aware of any special event, yet people seemed to be congregating in expectation of some kind of parade. Thanksgiving wasn't until next Thursday, so the excitement seemed out of place and made Marcia just a little jittery. She linked her arm into the crook of Marilyn's, and they moved about the moderate crowd, approaching the curb of Elm Street. Marcia was craning her neck to see down the street just what kind of vehicles were motoring nearer. She saw there was time, so the two crossed the street and walked over to the grassy knoll, a usually quiet place, to rest before heading back home. Marilyn paid no attention to what was going on around her. She was lost in the drawings on her box of animal crackers, holding it near her face as she let herself slip into the fantasy of the colorful scene. Marcia let herself be distracted by the excitement of the bystanders as the cars passed by where the two women stood. A sharp snapping sound rang out. People dropped to the ground, Marcia included, but Marilyn was in her own world, a grassy savanna with a monkey, a camel, an elephant, a tiger, and a cheetah, and, strangely enough, a buck deer. She was prying at the cardboard top in order to pull out a cracker and eat it. She then turned and crossed over to Elm Street and walked east, thinking about the return walk home. There were too many people out here. The atmosphere had become full of a feeling of dread and danger. Marcia panicked when she finally looked around and found that her sister was not in sight. There were people rising from the ground, others running about, some screaming, others crying. A motorcade had rushed down Elm Street as if the tires were on fire. Marcia stood on her toes and looked about, and there, at the corner of the plaza, there was Marilyn. She had stopped to look up and down the street before crossing. Marcia rushed in that direction, caught up with her sister, and the two women walked rapidly back home. Jasper was sitting at one of the frontward tables in the open hall of the Trade Mart, watching J. Eric Johnson being fussy at the main table up front. Jasper's table was not so far from Marcus Stanley's table. He could see Stanley's daughter Jerry and her husband excitingly gushing over their luck at having front row seats for the event. Jasper liked Stanley. They had a very cordial relationship within the club, but Jasper was always censoring himself due to his envy of Stanley's luck. Stanley's wife had first failed him by granting him Jerry, a beautiful daughter, but not the heir that should be expected. That became only a hiccup, though. 2 years later, Mary had given Stanley twins, a girl and a boy. The boy would surely serve, though Jasper couldn't understand why Stanley would have given his tickets to this important luncheon to that older daughter. These thoughts were interrupted by waiters filing into the space with trays of food. The guest of honor, listed on the 2,000 invitations, had not yet arrived, but Johnson had encouraged everyone to begin eating. There was only a slight delay. Minutes later, as Jasper tried to concentrate on cutting his steak into small, dice-sized pieces he could chew, Johnson came to the podium again and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? There's been a delay in the arrival of the motorcade. There has been a mishap. We do not know the extent of it or the exact nature. We believe from our report that we have just received that it's not serious. We hope you will keep your seats. As soon as we have something to tell you, believe me, we'll do it." Later that evening, Jasper sat looking at the television. The news seemed to be on a surreal loop. The reports were scattered. Information wasn't organized. The only thing that was sure was that Kennedy was dead and Johnson was now president. A Democrat from Texas. Jasper didn't like that at all. 2 days later, Jasper was again sitting in front of the television. Melinda was sitting over there, just to his left. Both were pickled. More details were being shared, but more details were being requested. Authorities were reaching out to anyone who had been there, looking for clues, looking for witnesses, looking for photographs and Super 8 movie roll. Pictures were shown on the television. Neither Jasper nor his wife were sober enough to see the one in which their daughter Marilyn stood, her back to the camera, her arms raised as she looked myopically at the box of animal crackers. Marcia would never see those images either. Despite the national melodrama, things in the Bruns house on Thomas Avenue fell back into their routine. Jasper III, young Jasper, died just 5 years later in 1968. His father, old Jasper, followed him in death just as man stepped out onto the moon. Melinda was finally hospitalized and passed away from liver failure. The girls, well, they were taken in by Melinda's family, almost as charity cases, as that construction supply company had been absorbed into a larger conglomeration when no heir was to be had to continue the dynasty.
You're listening to Radio Revel. Listen, like, subscribe, and share.